coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance.
It would be a decision which could only be taken once.
There's no argument over the choice between peace and war.
Unconfirmed reports about Gaddafi being captured.
This morning, I want to talk about the future of Europe.
This week, China hosted another China-South Asia forum in Kunming. So what is the policy pursued by Beijing in that part of the world? How are the key players, which are China, India and the US, likely to coexist in the new regional architecture which is emerging now? These are the issues we've been discussing with our guest speakers, Professor James Chin of Malaysia's School of Arts and Social Sciences at Monash University, Malaysia, and Dr. Pushpita Das of the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis in India. Speaking at a forum in Kunming, which is capital city of southwestern China's Yunnan Province, the Chinese Vice President Li Yunqiao said, and I quote, "Facing important opportunities for development, China and South Asia should make joint efforts to safeguard peace, adhere to independence and self-empowerment, oppose external interference, and the big and strong bullying the small and weak." End quote. According to Xinhua report, calling for dialogue and consultation for peacefully resolution of disputes rather than resorting to force, both sides should expand mutually beneficial cooperation and accelerate connectivity to forge a tightly integrated community of interests. And we have the question, how realistic are those expectations? This is something we started discussing with our guest speaker, Professor James Chin of Malaysia's School of Arts and Social Sciences at Monash University in Malaysia.
China had a rocky relationship with South Asia. As you know, for a very long time now, almost 50 years, they had a border dispute with India. And also both India and China are in a competition to exert influence over countries like Nepal, which sits between India and China. So the recent forum really is China trying to move the relationship forward, because China is now emphasizing more on economic links rather than political solutions.
On the other hand, as far as I remember, the Indian government has made a special focus on developing rational relations with China. Do you think they're going to succeed in that?
Well, the relationship with China, as I mentioned, a lot of it has got to do with the border issue. For example, they have never managed to resolve the issue over Kashmir. So I think what they're thinking now is that because of all the political problems we're facing, let's concentrate on economic cooperation. And if we can have a really good economic relationship, maybe we can resolve the political issues after that.
What are the prospects for the developing of economic relations with China for the countries of the region?
The prospects are actually very good. As you know, the Chinese now are basically the world's second largest economy. And most studies will tell you that by the year 2030, China will be the world's biggest economy. And India, because of its population, size, and technology, it will probably be one of the leading economic countries in the 21st century as well. But of course, India is much more difficult to grow because it has a different political system. But in terms of population, I think for this century, China and India will play a key role. So because of the huge population, you can expect that the economic relations will most probably be successful.
And what are the other areas for cooperation?
If we assume that China will be the major economic superpower of the 21st century, this means that China will play an increasing role in terms of international security. And because the South Indian subcontinent is still quite unstable, for example, India and Pakistan always had a lot of problems, again with the border. And also you got problems in countries like Nepal, which borders both China and India. So I suspect that all this means that the Chinese and Indians will have to be very careful in how they manage the relations.
Just to remind you, our guest speaker is Professor James Chin of Malaysia's School of Arts and Social Sciences at Monash University, Malaysia.
Burning Point.
In fact, you've mentioned Pakistan, and Pakistan seems to be one of the key allies of China in that region, and now the whole situation in Pakistan is extremely shaky. What could China do to somehow minimize its risks. And on the other hand, if we move a little bit westwards, I think that I've read that China has made a substantial investment into Afghanistan, well, and it has been trading oil with Iran. So how could China hedge the risks it is facing now?
Well, China is not going to hedge the risk. The official Chinese policy is that they want to be friends with everyone. But in the case of Iran and Afghanistan, their position is basically to oppose the Americans. So you can't really take that as the standard Chinese policy. It's because of what is happening in the Middle East. They are behaving the way they are over the Iranians and the Afghanistan issue. In terms of Pakistan and India, China in the last few years have actually taken a more even approach between Pakistan and India. It is true that in the past they were closer to Pakistan. Part of the reason was because the Americans were trying to exert influence in Pakistan as well. As your listeners know, in recent times, Pakistan has actually had a very rocky relationship with the Americans, and it will appear now that the Chinese are actually more influential in Pakistan now than the Americans.
The Chinese are still investing into infrastructure projects.
Yes, the Chinese are interested in two things. They're interested in building economic links, and this is mostly through investments and infrastructure projects. But they're also very interested in natural resources of these countries. As you know, the Chinese economy is growing in double-digit figures, so they need resources from every part of the world. So there are some resources they need from places like Pakistan and India. So I assume that they will push for trade links rather than political links.
What do they expect in turn for their investment?
Well, a lot of these investments are actually done by Chinese state-owned enterprises, or they're owned by government companies. Most of the time, they do not have any ulterior motives other than to make money. But there are some strategic investments, especially in terms of infrastructure development. The Chinese strongly believe that you need to build the infrastructure in place before trade will take off.
Well, but this is a sound position. And if I remember it correctly, for instance, if we look at Burma, they have been spending a lot of money, a lot of effort and a lot of time building a road that would bring them directly to the Indian Ocean. And that was a matter of major concern for the Indian government. So don't you think that the Chinese are performing a very careful and tricky balancing act in that region?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, they have always had a difficult relationship with India. But building roads across Burma, the main reason, as you mentioned, was because they're looking for outlet to the Indian Ocean. Yes, the Indians are unhappy, but there's really not much they can do, given the fact that we're talking about a separate sovereign country like Burma. But having said that, I think that the Indians also realize that in the 21st century, political issues is best resolved with economic and trade.
But then what do you think the U.S. is going to do? Like you said, since political issues are resolved through economy and trade, but the U.S. have been prioritizing this region for quite some time in terms of their political influence and perhaps in terms of containing China. So are those two countries, are they heading for a bit of more confrontation?
Not really. I mean, the U.S., of course, compared to China, they're much closer to India than, say, the Chinese. But there's really not much the U.S. can do because it's quite clear that the U.S. is a declining power over the long term, while China and India are rising powers. So there's really not much the Americans can do other than reinforce the current links. The one area where the Americans have an advantage over the Chinese, of course, is in the terms of military alliance and high-end technology. Other than these two areas, I think in every other area they're losing out to the Chinese.
Absolutely, and they're building up their military presence there.
Yes.
The build-up of military presence by itself is still an alarming sign.
Yes. The South Asians have a thing called the South Asian Community, or SAC. Right now, SAC is not a military alliance. They haven't discussed security issues for a very long time now. But I think, generally speaking, we don't expect any trouble in the South Indian situation or the South Asia situation. I think over the next few years, the major priority for the Americans in Asia region will still be the nuclear issue in North Korea.
And the Chinese are extremely instrumental in dealing with that issue, as far as I understand.
The Chinese are also playing a key role in the North Korean issue. And this is the reason why I said earlier that it's very difficult for the Americans to deal with the Chinese, because in terms of North Korea, Burma, Pakistan, they seem to have the upper hand. The only area where they sort of are inferior to the Americans is the Indian-American relationship.
Dr. Chen, thank you so much. And just to remind you, our guest speaker was Professor James Chin of Malaysia School of Arts and Social Sciences at Monash University in Malaysia. This is Burning Point discussing the Chinese policy in South Asia. And now we are joined by our next guest speaker, Dr. Pushpita Das of the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis in New Delhi, India.
Yeah, South Asia is traditionally, India's influence has been, should be predominant in South Asia region. And of late we find also, China is also showing interest, is showing its interest to become a member of the SAARC forum, where it is right now enjoying the observer status. And China has also developed good contact and relationship with major countries in South Asia, like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal. They have a very good relationship. I mean, China of late has developed very good relationship with these countries, particularly with Pakistan. Of course, we will welcome China's relationship with any of the South Asian countries. India has no issue at all. But particularly with regard to Pakistan, India has at times concern about China's engagement in Pakistan, particularly with regard to the strategic nexus between China and Pakistan, and with particular reference to infrastructural development in like Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. And India has taken up this issue on different occasions at the highest level with the Chinese authority whenever there has been any meeting. And similarly, we notice that China has also developing infrastructure in countries like Sri Lanka, and China has excellent relationship now with Nepal. So it's fine, absolutely, but so far as Pakistan is concerned, we have some concern about the nature of relationship that China has with Pakistan. But we have to live with that. I mean, it is their choice. We can't do anything about that.
As far as I remember, several years ago, I suppose India has adopted a new strategy for China. Is my understanding correct? This strategy aimed at developing rational cooperation with that country. Is my impression correct? So,
yes, absolutely.
And what do you see as the prospect for the development of economic ties with China?
Well, right now, we are aiming at to increase the trade volume in the year 2015 to $150 billion.
Oh, that's a target.
Yeah, but there is a huge trade deficit between the two countries, like 100 and about 30 to 40 million US dollar is the trade gap, and which is adverse to India.
And in fact, what are the areas of cooperation? What are the principal areas of cooperation between?
Normally, we have been exporting basic raw material to China, and India has been importing value-added goods. And now we would like China should invest in India. China should, in our infrastructural development, China can invest, and maybe China can also come to the manufacturing sector, and this trade imbalance need to be rectified.
Dr. Das, now, as I've been talking to various experts on the issue, I have noticed that some countries in the region see the development of the Chinese foreign connections as a threat to their own national security. Just how justified is that position? What do you think?
Naturally, we have certain concern about China's engagement in our telecom sector. There is some kind of a dilemma is also there, and that needs to be addressed, and I think India is addressing. India has to move very cautiously in some sensitive sectors like telecom sector, yes.
Sir, thank you so much.
coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance.
It would be a decision which could only be taken once.
There's no argument over the choice between peace and war.
Unconfirmed reports about Gaddafi being captured.
This morning, I want to talk about the future of Europe.